It's the third time I'm going to be introducing myself today. So hello everyone, thanks for joining us. You are on the platform track today. So we're going to be talking about migration tools in this session. We're going to be looking at how we can migrate to Azure. So for those of you that do not know me, my name is Danail Dimitrov. If I haven't had the pleasure of working with you as one of Grey Matter's customers, new or existing. And I am actually a cloud and infrastructure solutions specialist. So I focus on migrating a lot of our customers onto the Azure platform and moving those customers into more modern platform services so they can achieve a saving in doing so and also benefit from that flexibility of adopting platforms such as Azure, of course. So I don't know if all of you have seen this diagram before. This diagram depicts about a large proportion of the more common services that we use on the Azure platform. I won't go as far as to say it incorporates everything because so much is being added on a day-to-day basis to this particular platform. So in today's session, it's going to be broken down into two segments. I'll be delivering the first half, and then my colleague kind of from Microsoft, Gregory, is going to be delivering the second half. We're going to be covering migration tools to migrate to web apps. We're going to be covering migration tools to migrate to SQL database, and we're going to be covering tools to migrate to virtual machines as well. So for those more traditional scenarios where we're having to do a lift and shift. So what does a migration path look like for us? So we recognize that migration paths can be broken down into 4 different stages. So you have the assessment piece. With the assessment piece, you get to ask yourself the questions: what am I migrating from? What am I migrating to? How much is it going to cost me to adopt these new services that I'm migrating to? How much effort is going to be involved in that migration? Is there going to be any downtime affiliated with migrating to these services? And then what is my plan? What am I going to do first? What I'm going to move on to afterwards? So that's the whole assessment piece right there, is thinking about all of those different questions that you need to ask yourself in the first instance. The next bit for us is to obviously do the migration, so to actually carry out that particular migration and move everything across. And then we can look at optimizing everything. So we can optimize in terms of cost. So we can optimize exactly what it is that we're using to make sure that we achieve the best cost per performance ratio, make sure we're not wasting any resources and just over provisioning everything needlessly. And of course we get to optimize for performance as well, because we want that balance. We don't want to be skimping too much on cost and impacting the performance for our end customers. We want to make sure they still have that performance in adopting the cloud. And if anything, we want to improve on that performance moving forwards. So the migrate piece can really be broken down into different segments depending on what it is that we're migrating from and what it is we're migrating to. So simple approach is of course a rehost. That's a lift and shift. That's when we're adopting like for like the infrastructure that we've currently got deployed on premise on the Azure cloud. So that's of course our Linux and Windows based virtual machines on there. We can then look to refactor. Is a different approach. So refactoring is where we refactor the code to be able to adopt different services. We can look to re-architect the infrastructure that we're using. So we're starting to adopt more of the more modern services that bring that flexibility to us. And we can then rebuild as well from the ground up in certain cases. So the migration path for our customers will vary depending on what it is they're migrating and the technologies that they choose to adopt in the process and in doing so. So with the Azure platform, we've got a number of tools available for us. There's so many listed on there. There's actually more that haven't made their way to the list here. So we've got tools for migrating infrastructure, such as the Azure Migrate that we have in there, Azure Site Recovery. Those are tools that are available on there for migrating infrastructure. We've got tools available for migrating data or databases. So we've got the Data Experimentation Assistant, Data Migration Service. We've also got, Azure Data Box for actually migrating large volumes of data onto the Azure platform, and the SQL Server Migration Assistant that we're going to cover later in today's session. And of course, one tool that remains on my list is the Azure Cost Calculator. For those of you laughing at me, I do not think you can do a single migration to Azure without doing an upfront without actually determining what that's going to look like and how much those services are going to cost you moving forwards. I like to say we've all got that kind of finances at our disposal to be able to mindlessly adopt new technologies, but we realistically have to look at what those technologies are going to cost. So I'm yet to actually carry out a migration that does not incorporate the Azure cost calculator, of course. So I'm adamant about that one. And of course, there's third-party tools available to us as well. So Grey Matter use some of these third-party tools as well for migrating certain services. So these can be, these can range from migrating infrastructure, physical nodes onto the Azure platform, or there could be services used to basically adopt identity and move on to platforms like Office 365 to leverage the same Azure Active Directory moving forwards. So there's a number of technologies available there. Microsoft embrace all of these ISV solutions, so we'd like to see some of you make it to that list if you develop these kind of platforms as well. Now, let's look at Azure Migrate in the first instance. So we can look at how we're going to migrate virtual machines, because that is going to be the most commonly sought after scenario. So we have the Azure Migrate service available on the platform for us. So Azure Migrate allows us to discover and assess our on-premises service, so we can assess any VMware virtual machines out there in our current environment. It allows us to visualize dependencies, so we can see if a particular server is calling out to any other servers, it's got connection strings for applications or databases, we can visualize those dependencies and find out what the knock-on effect is going to be, or how many servers we need to migrate in one go ahead of time before we actually break something in the environment and then suffer the consequences at a later date. Azure Migrate allows us to estimate the right size of the VM. So we can look at what the current performance is, what the current resources you have provisioned on that virtual machine is, and we can then look at recommending a feasible sizing on the Azure platform, so that you're not provisioning again a VM that's too big, but at the same time you've got comparative performance to what it is you're currently experiencing. And we can also report on potential issues. So if ahead of time we foresee certain issues with compatibility with the actual virtual machines that you've got, we can report on those issues and we can suggest a course of action for you to remediate those problems before you start to migrate across to the platform. And of course, the last bit is the actual tools. So the Azure Migrate platform will actually recommend the tools that you can use to facilitate that particular migration to the cloud. So we've got that with the Azure Migrate. Now, the first piece for us is the discovery. We've got a light discovery and we've got a deep discovery. So the light discovery is based on a collector appliance. That collector appliance is configured and it can tell us exactly what our servers are. But if we wanted to look at the dependencies bit, if we want to map out those dependencies, what we would need to do is we would need to provision an OMS workspace and install an agent on each of the virtual machines that we plan on migrating. That particular agent can then monitor any of that communication that's going out from that particular virtual machine, and it can push that out to the OMS workspace, and in turn it can then facilitate that map of dependencies across different servers that we have in the environment, so we can understand what these connections are. Now, if we look at a discovery, press the wrong button. If we look at our discovery, the first step for us is to connect into our VMware environment. Once we connect to the VMware environment, we download the collector appliance, which is an OVA file. And that OVA file is then used to spin up the collector appliance virtual machine in our VMware environment. We then need to connect to the appliance, to the collector VM appliance. We need to configure the discovery. So we basically pointed to the Azure Migrate project we've already defined in our environment. So we're telling the collector VM where it's going to push out all of that data it collects about our environment. And once we've done that, we're ready to collect data. So the collector VM will then look at the VMware cluster. It will gather raw metadata about the virtual machines we've got defined in that particular environment, including the performance of those particular virtual machines. It will then push that out to our Azure Migrate service, which will then process that data and display that data in our Azure Migrate portal. So the next step for us to then do is to create an assessment. So for the assessment piece, what we do is we group all of the VMs that we've gathered the data for, and we create an assessment so that we can then analyze that data in a way that makes sense to us. So we haven't got an example of this, we haven't got a demo for this particular example, but I can show you a couple of screenshots of what that looks like in a bit. So The assessment piece, what kind of data is that going to feed out to us? Well, that's going to tell us our migration suitability. So it will, as already stated, it will tell us whether this VM is going to work and the tools that we need to use to migrate that across. It will tell us that right sizing. And the way that it does that, as previously mentioned, is by looking at existing performance versus the amount of capacity provisioned on our VM. And it uses something that we call the comfort factor. So the comfort factor, take an example of 2. What it will do is it will actually multiply the amount of resources we want to provision. So for example, 2 cores, it will multiply by 2. So take for instance, if I've got a virtual machine with 2 cores currently provisioned, that virtual machine is currently performing at 50%. What Azure Migrate will do is it will look at that particular VM. It will say that you're provisioning, you're only using half the provision, so you should only be provisioning a VM with 1 core. And then it'll look at the comfort factor and it'll multiply by that comfort factor and it'll say, actually, we should be provisioning with 2 cores because we've got a comfort factor of 2. So we're able to kind of define this little blanket of safety around the sizing that we provision our virtual machines with. And then, of course, it will tell us exactly how much this will cost. So we'll look at these sizing recommendations on the platform and it'll tell us how much that would cost us ahead of time in the right regions that we want to provision those virtual machines in. And it ends up looking something like this in the end. So what we have is the portal. We have the Azure Readiness State, which is where we're able to determine what virtual machines are ready to be migrated without any potential issues. It takes a look at the Azure compute and storage costs, and it does all of those estimations for us. Now, Azure Migrate is not without its limitations. So we've got Azure Migrate version 1 and Azure Migrate version 2. Azure Migrate version 1, which is the version currently available to us, supports VMware vCenter environments 5.5 up to through to 6.7. Hyper-V support is coming out in Azure Migrate version 2, which is currently in private preview. There's no support for physical servers at the present, but there are partner tools currently available for us to migrate or use Azure Migrate for Azure Migrate kind of functionality for physical servers in our environment. Azure Migrate is currently limited to 1,500 VMs in a single discovery on a single project. But there is again a private preview to extend that to 10,000 machines in a single project. So we can request that as well. We can opt into that preview ahead of time. And Azure Migrate supports 20 projects per subscription. So those are current restrictions for us to be aware of when we're planning those migrations in our environments. So now that we've done all of the assessment, we've done all of the discovery, the next step for us is to actually migrate those virtual machines. And that's where Azure Site Recovery comes into play. So Azure Site Recovery enables us to migrate full virtual machines across into the Azure environment. And it does that with zero application data loss and downtime. Well, not zero downtime, zero application data loss. So we'll talk about how that actually achieves zero data loss in a little bit of time. But what it essentially allows us to do is it allows us to mirror all of the transactions across. We've got near zero application downtime in doing so, because what we essentially do is we set up, we replicate everything across, we then initiate a failover, and in doing that failover, all of the VMs are then started up on the target VM sizes in our Azure environment seamlessly, and we haven't actually lost we haven't really force much of a downtime in our environment because that process is very quick. Our VMs are already in our Azure environment ready for them to be switched on. We're not actually waiting for the data to then be copied across, causing greater downtimes. Azure Site Recovery has got great coverage of hypervisors, so we can use that with VMware essentially through a slightly more long-winded configuration. We can actually natively support Hyper-V because we use the replication services already available in Hyper-V out of the box, so it's quite seamless. But we can actually use that to migrate from other clouds as well. So the technology that we use for VMware clusters can then translate into any other cloud out there. So if you wanted to move from other cloud platforms like AWS, Alibaba Cloud, or Google Cloud, then you can migrate seamlessly off using Azure Site Recovery. So the way that works is very similar to Azure Migrate. So there is an appliance in the vCenter, which you'll see a visual of shortly after, and there's an agent for Hyper-V environments as well. So the appliance can actually be deployed into any other environment out there where we can spare a virtual machine to serve this particular service in replicating data across. So migrating an application from Hyper-V. In the first instance, what we need to do is we need to create an Azure Recovery Services Vault. The Azure Recovery Services Vault actually holds all of the data for the virtual machines whilst they're being replicated off to the Azure cloud. We then download and install the agent on our particular virtual machine, on our particular Hyper-V hypervisor. Then what we do is replicate data across, and we do that using HTTPS. Securely from our hypervisors out there with the agent running. And then we fail over. Well, but before we fail over, we use something similar to, I guess it's a mobility agent, that basically between backups to the Azure Recovery Services Vault, it actually commits all of the right operations in our Recovery Services Vault as well. So when we actually come to do the migration, when we come to do the failover, we've got all of the up-to-date written transactions, and we're not waiting for those to replicate across in the last moment of time. So that essentially results in a lot quicker of a migration for us. Now that's the very same example with other clouds, or in this particular case, VMware, involves a little bit more configuration. So we still create the Azure Recovery Services Vault. That Azure Recovery Services Vault still holds exactly the same information, but we're now having to download and install 3 different types of services. So we've got a process server and a configuration server. The configuration server is going to be the backbone that's going to push all of that data into the Recovery Services Vault. That configuration server comes with an in-process server. So those 2 roles are effectively in one, and they're able to support up to 200 VMs in our environment. But if we wanted to, and our environment comprised of more virtual machines, what we can do is we can provision additional process servers that then gives us more capacity to back up more servers and migrate more servers in one go. Then what we do afterwards is we replicate that data across periodically through backups. We then install this mobility service. And this mobility service is installed on each individual virtual machine. So that allows us to bridge the gap by not using Hyper-V technology. So with Hyper-V technology, we're able to commit all of these write operations ad hoc, but we're not able to do that with technologies like VMware or AWS. So that's where we've got the mobility service. And the mobility service will look at any new write operations since the last backup, and it'll periodically push those write operations into Recovery Services Vault so that we still have consistently the same VMs when we come in to migrate those VMs across. And then, of course, we fail over in a very traditional sense with Azure Site Recovery. And that allows us to then spin up that environment and switch everything off on-premise. So we've got, with Azure Site Recovery, it's a very comprehensive solution. That list is currently out of date because I'm sure we support Windows Server 2019 as well. But it gives you an idea as to just how many things you can replicate across. So you can replicate it only supports managed disks, and you can replicate disks or data disks, additional disks of up to 4 terabytes in size as well. So that's all well and good when you're lifting and shifting and doing virtual machines, but what happens when you want to actually adopt platform services in one go and you don't want to introduce additional steps in doing so? Then what we can do is we can look at migrating Azure Platform Services. So with Azure Platform Services, we've got, why do we want to adopt platform services? So we've already covered that we want to adopt platform services for speed, because it's a lot quicker, it's a lot more flexible, we can scale up a lot quicker, we can be a lot more reactive to demand as well. We're not having to do any of that upfront commitment side of things. Costs, we can achieve a cost saving in doing so, and we can achieve all of that wonderful resiliency as well. Throughout our environment. So there's a couple of tools I want to talk about. I want to show you very quickly, but conscious of time, I'm going to dive straight into the App Service Migration Assistant. So the App Service Migration Assistant supports Windows and Linux web apps. It also supports databases. So if my web app actually talks to a database, and it's got a backend somewhere, it actually supports those databases, and it can facilitate me in migrating databases across as well and advise me on what to do. It's got compatibility analysis, so it's able to look at my web app and look at whether that's likely to run in Azure Web Apps as well. And it allows me to migrate across. And the way that happens is I basically download the migration assistant locally on my server, my IIS server, for example, that's running my web app. Then I trigger an assessment and migrate across. And after I do the assessment, I get the all clear that my app is supported in app services, and I do the migration across. It does it all in one go. So actually spin up the web app and it'll give you the URL for the web app there and then for you to access. So I'll quickly dive into a very quick demo of Azure App Services. So I've got this particular VM here. This particular VM has got a website. So if I open up Internet Information Services, this has got a very bog standard application on here. That website is the website I want to migrate across. So if I open this up, I've configured it to a very bizarre port 81, which is non-standard, but it does the job for me right now anyway. So I'm interested in migrating this web app across. What I can now do is I can open the App Service Migration tool. So the App Service Migration tool is actually the new tool that we've got available. Up until now, we've recommended using the Azure App Service Migration Assistant. So I'll show you both tools and show you what those look like very quickly now. So the Azure App Service Migration Assistant allows me to select the web app that I want to migrate across. So I'm using a local web app. I can point this to another IIS server that I've got access to locally, but my interest is in migrating from this server alone. I want to migrate my migration example web app. And for that migration example web app, I can do a readiness assessment. And I can see that everything appears all good. There is a compatibility warning, and that particular compatibility warning basically states that I've got an unsupported binding because web apps in Azure only support port 80 and port 443. So we will actually push this out to port 80 in the process, and I can begin the migration. So I've got a web app already available in the cloud. And what this will do is it will just migrate to an existing web app. So I've got this migration web app here. So I'm actually going to use an existing web app because in the interest of time. So with this particular web app, I've got an endpoint here, which is going to load. There we go. ISV Partner Day, migration example. That's good. What I'm actually going to do, because my web app locally is exactly the same, is I'm going to change that particular view for the main app. ISV Partner Day 2, demonstrating a change in the web app. Now I'll use the Migration Assistant, and I'll choose what I want this particular web app to go across to. So I'm not actually able to use an existing app service plan in the migration assistant we've been using up until now. I can use an app service plan, but it will actually provision a new web app in the process because the idea is that this step is followed when you're migrating brand new web apps. So I'm going to use CDFG. There is a few issues. CDFG events. It does work, I promise. Although I'm not quite sure why it's kicking up this, which is an existing resource group. And going to choose West Europe, and I'll start my migration. And what this will do is it will doesn't want to work.
United Kingdom, surely, isn't it?
Just anything that works at this moment in time. So, okay, in the interest of time, this particular tool does actually work, but I think my runtime for some reason it's try one more time. If it doesn't work, we'll just showcase the new tool available to us anyway. Okay. West Europe. It's only because I've got an apps service plan in that region. Usually it does an error like this, but I have seen that message before. I'd be lying if I hadn't. Okay, so we're not going to use the old tool, it just doesn't work, and the demo gods are certainly not with me today. So we're going to use the new Azure App Service Migration tool. So if you were to look at the migration documentation, this is what you'll be pointed to now moving forwards anyway. So I want to migrate my migration example, and we're going to do the same. With my migration example, it now does spot an error with my port binding, and it's actually telling me that it's not even going to let me carry on. So it's going to make me follow best practice, and what I'll do with my particular map, I'm going to add because I'm already using port 80, I'm going to change my port binding to port 443, remove 81, and I'm going to try that again. So let's try this again, migration example. Now we're happy that we haven't got any errors. It is telling me that my certificate's a bit of an issue, but we're not going to worry about that. Now I need to log in. So if we copy this, I need to use an account locally on the tenancy. That tenancy is not the same as my account, so I'm going to actually have to use a different account to log into this. So I'll use this one. With any luck, I can type my password in right. There we go. Navigate back to the tool. And it's now proceeded on to the next stage. I've got to do that a second time to authenticate on the tenant. So one for Azure, one for the tenant. And again, I need to use consistently the same account. And I'll log in again. Okay. Now that I've logged in, I can proceed to choose what I want to migrate this to. So I'm going to use my existing resource group. I'm going to use, I can't use the same web app that already exists, so I'm going to define a new web app in West Europe. And I'm going to call this SV Demo Migrate. Just make sure that's okay. Migrate. This will actually provision a new app service plan for me, I believe. I don't believe I chose an existing one. But essentially, this is what it'll do, is it'll create the two resources. So that'll be an app service plan. It'll be a web app that it'll create for me in a process. And then it'll actually publish the site content in 5 quick steps. And hopefully, we should see very quick turnaround, because this virtual machine is actually hosted on Azure. So my network connectivity should not be an influential factor here. There we go. And actually, what we will end up having in the end is a URL that we can navigate to see that new migrated web app. Now, okay, so go to your website. And now we should see ISV Partner Day 2 that we changed the contents of the website to. Okay. I think you're going to have to take my word for it, because we'll navigate back to that in a second. There we go. And that's done. So that's how we migrate a web app. It's nice and simple. Now I'm really quickly going to move on to the next segment of the presentation, which is to talk about databases in the same fashion. So we migrated web apps. Now let's have a look at migrating databases. Now there's loads of different services out there, but essentially, over time, we've seen people migrate from different technologies. And migration we do a lot of, especially from SQL servers. So the older the technology that we're trying to migrate from, the more problems that are introduced. So if we're migrating from physical servers, for example, that can be quite difficult. If we're migrating from virtual machines, that's not so bad, because we can use tools that are already available for us. If the version of SQL Server that we're using supports always-on availability groups, then we can use, for example, always-on availability groups to mirror the databases across and use that to migrate. But there is also loads of tools available for us to migrate across with. So if we look at two different paths, we can upgrade or we can convert. So if we're going from an existing platform that's supported, so if we're going from Microsoft SQL Server to a conventional SQL Server or Azure SQL databases, then we can use the Data Migration Assistant, or we can use the Data Experimentation Assistant in there. If we're looking to convert from other database engines, then what we've got available to us is the SQL Server Migration Assistant. So that's a selection of different tools that's currently available to us. Now, we're going to look at the Data Migration Assistant throughout the demo. So the Data Migration Assistant, the way that works is initially it does an assessment. So it identifies whether or not our database is likely to be supported. If it notices any issues, what it can do is it can actually generate the SQL for us to update our schema in our database to rectify those issues. And then we can then apply the schema through the tool, and we can migrate all of our data across to Azure SQL services. We can also use the Data Migration Assistant, because the Data Migration Service allows us to do that in real time with a live migration with minimal downtime and interruption. So I'll very quickly showcase what the migration for a database looks like. So I've got a local database here on this particular virtual machine. That local database has got a bit of data, but we're not going to have time to explore what that data looks like. So in the first instance, I need to come up with whether or not this is an assessment or a migration. So I want to do a migration after my assessment as well. I'll come up with a name for this migration. And I'm going to choose my source as SQL Server, which is a local database, and my target is Azure SQL Database. So choose create, and I now need to point this to the server that I want to migrate from. So I choose this particular server and connect to it locally, and I get to choose the database that I want to migrate across, which is this particular database there. And likewise, I need to do the same with my target. So I'm migrating to a server I've already defined on Azure. That particular server I'm going to authenticate on as well and connect. Now, if it doesn't like it, because I pressed enter. So what's happened right now is this particular machine cannot connect. So this is 52.178.77.17. What I need to make sure is that this particular machine can connect to it. And once that's the case, I can then migrate this across. Anyway, I'm going to have to show those people that are interested how the migration tool works later, because we are really running out of time today in today's session, and all others building up to it, if I'm being honest. So there is also a website that you can navigate to called the Database Migration Guide website, which will actually demonstrate all of those different tools. You basically choose the source database that you want to migrate from, the target database engine that you want to migrate to, and that will actually walk you through all of the steps in 3 different actions as to how you can migrate across to that. And with that note, I'm handing over to Gregory from Microsoft, who will talk you through an SMB migration example.
Thank you very much, Dan. Wow. I'll let you catch a breath after that. That was a fantastic whirlwind tour of all of our tools. And actually, I think you've done a fantastic job of illustrating both where those tools fit in and also giving us a live example, and very brave of you to have a crack at doing them live. Fantastic. This is an example that I've put together for some of our SMB partners. And I know that many of you in the room will be serving the SMB market. The reason I've put together this example is I wanted to try and build kind of a real world example where we're taking a traditional SMB customer and moving them entirely to the cloud, just showcasing some of the tools at a very high level and where they're used in that journey. And so the framework that we're going to use as part of this is the one that Dan mentioned earlier on, which is our Azure Migration framework, which is our assess, migrate, optimize, secure, and manage. And I'm going to talk through the first 3 of the 4 of these steps. First of those being the assessment piece. Dan obviously mentioned Azure Migrate. We have the version 1 available at the moment, version 2 coming soon. And also we've got third-party tools like Turbonomic and Cloudamize also available, particularly if you're working with larger deployments and larger enterprises. But with smaller customers, my general advice is if you're just working with a handful of virtual machines, in a lot of cases you can get away with mapping that out yourself rather than going to the expense and time of deploying a virtual machine or deploying a solution into that environment. And for the simple SMB networks, I've seen customers and partners where they've just literally mapped it out. Perhaps they've only got a handful of workloads in there, and they just need to have think about what are we migrating, so workload, where is that workload at the moment, where is it going to end up ultimately, when are we going to move it, and bear in mind that this is really important that we get the order right for a lot of these workloads because some of them have dependencies. And then finally, I've added a little note section here just in terms of what tools we're going to use to achieve that. And you'll see that we're migrating these workloads in a sensible order, and you don't have to go to this level of detail if you don't necessarily want to, but I've done this for the purpose of this. And we're going to follow the same approach to map this workload from its current state to the target migration. There's some of the infrastructure roles here, which are more of the sort of fundamental infrastructure roles rather than the kind of core application roles that we've got here. And so once we have the plan in place, and the next stage is migrate and getting our customers onto a modern, supported, secure environment. So here's where we start with, a simple SMB customer with 2 servers. It could be small business server, it could be a Windows Server 2008. Bear in mind, with Windows Server 2008, SQL Server 2008, those are going end of support in the next year. So those particular products are certainly worth targeting from a partner point of view. And you can see we've got our network here, which is connected to a traditional SMB firewall router. So first step we're going to take is we're going to create an Azure virtual network with a site-to-site link with a gateway subnet. And the VM subnet that we'll create is a 25-bit subnet, which gives us enough capacity for 100 virtual machines. And this is fine for an SMB environment. You might want to resize that subnet if you are working with larger customers. And then the next thing we'll do is we'll create the Azure virtual machine, and we will join it to the domain and promote that to be a domain controller. So in terms of that service purpose, as well as giving redundancy from the domain controller we have on premises, it's also helping us to service any additional workloads that we're going to run on virtual machines in Azure. And then, because we're going to be migrating many of our workloads to Microsoft 365, we're going to install Azure AD Connect to synchronize the traditional Active Directory which we have running on that domain controller with our modern cloud-first identity, which is Azure AD. And that's going to underpin all of the services that we have in Microsoft 365, and also give us a single sign-on, consistent experience for the end users. And so we're ready now to migrate our customers' data. And most of the customers that I have worked with, the usual first workload to move over, if they have it in their environment, is Exchange. I suspect because you're mainly on the ISV side, this may or may not be an area that you're familiar with, but many of our partners are using tools like Skykick and BitTitan to migrate the Exchange data over. Then we've got the SharePoint server, and we've got, again, tools that are both third-party, so ShareGate, for example, and also we've got our new SharePoint migration tool as well, which is available for migrating SharePoint server to SharePoint Online. That tool that we've just released for SharePoint migration also does technically work for Teams as well, if you're looking to migrate a document library into Microsoft Teams. So bear that in mind too. And so some of that, let me have a look, just go back. Yep, and then the next step, we're going to migrate the user shares as well. So taking the user shares, moving that ideally to OneDrive for Business, and then the company share, either Teams, possibly SharePoint. If they need it for certain reasons, then we may decide that the company share or shared folder that an application uses may require something like an Azure virtual machine with the traditional file services installed, especially if they're not using Azure AD, especially if they're using the traditional Active Directory permissions. And so the next stage then is to look at the line of business application that we've got, and this is a traditional line of business application, perhaps running IIS and SQL Server. And because this is running on SQL 2008, let's say that the developer's gone out of business and there's no support for anything more up to date than that, we can do actually a simple lift and shift migration from the old virtual machines or physical servers into Azure. And one of the benefits of that actually is for customers who are running Windows Server or SQL Server 2008, we can give them an extra 3 years of security updates when they move to an Azure virtual machine still running on Windows Server 2008 or SQL Server 2008. So we're buying in a little bit of extra time there for that customer. So we've moved everything now from or nearly everything from the left-hand side to the right. So we can decommission that application server. There's nothing really on premises anymore that needs Active Directory, so we can demote that domain controller and retire that server as well. And so we've effectively removed all of our traditional workloads over, and within some customers that actually might be where you finish and decide that that's it, we're gonna call it a day. But actually there's still a load of work that could potentially be done by a partner or an ISV to optimize and look to improve even further, moving some of those IaaS services to PaaS. And in terms of what we can do there, we can replace that line of business application that we had from a virtual machine, and perhaps we can replace that with either a third-party SaaS option or a PaaS offering to take advantage of those services and simplification in terms of management and overhead there. So moving that across. Perhaps we can also look at the file server that we've provisioned there. Obviously the Azure Files team are innovating all the time, and some of the functionality that perhaps wasn't there 6 months ago may be available now in our Azure Files platform service. So we can migrate from the file server into Azure Files and decommission that server. And you can start to see that we're slowly getting to the point where all of that traditional legacy infrastructure, those virtual machines, can be decommissioned because there's nothing left that have dependencies on it. And so, we've got some great options as well for those customers who aren't quite cloud ready, and we can talk about that. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this option. Needless to say, we do have hybrid options available. I think that's actually one of our key differentiators. We're strong in cloud and also with hybrid as well. So with that, I think, are we done? Fantastic. One final thing I'll just say, Dan mentioned earlier the Azure Migrate v2 private preview. That is really interesting, and particularly if you've got lots of customers on Hyper-V, you'll really want to take advantage of that and start to learn to use it. It's building in our assessment technologies from Migrate v1 with the migration technologies that we're going to build into the tool as well. If you want to self-nominate yourself for the private preview, then you can access that via aka.ms/migrate futures. So aka.ms migrate futures. And I'll pop that up on the screen in a second. And so you just need to fill in a short form. That'll get approved, and you can then get access to the private preview of the next version of Azure Migrate. So with that, Dan, do you have any final words?
No. Thank you for
I appreciate we're a few minutes over time, so with that in mind, thank you very much for your time. I'll let you run on to your next session. Thank you.